Once again, I return from the den of fear that is college. I've got a game here to talk about, and it was recommended to me by the user Parsley Bunny on that video I made requesting horror-themed games. And I'm really glad they did, because I really enjoyed the weird little experience that is Yuppie Psycho. At first I actually brushed this game off as another generic pixel horror title, but then I watched the trailer, and I was actually pretty surprised. I very quickly found that it was a very me sort of game. What I mean by that is this game has really good monster designs, and I'm an absolute sucker for that sort of thing. Going on to play the game proper proved that what they showed in the trailer wasn't simply just a flash in the pan that they threw in there to look nice. The game has that through and through from beginning to end. A good example that isn't too spoilery would be this one early game enemy. It's this little organic landmine that, when you approach it, it opens up its single eye and flashes this green light. If you get closer, it turns red, and if you get closer than that, it blows up right in your face. A puzzle I really like related to this monster is one where you go through a room of them, and when you get to the end, the lights get turned off, so you have to navigate back to the door of the room by the light they emit when you get dangerously close to them, and I thought that was a really interesting, fun use of that monster design. I actually distinctly remember the thing that sold me on the game was watching the trailer and seeing this horrifying printer walking around on human hands and thinking that was one of the most dumb fun things I'd seen in a very long time. Stuff like that is the primary reason why I like the game as much as I do. It's less an actual proper horror game and more a haunted house ride by way of office hijinks. Not to say that the game doesn't have some good scares here and there, any halfway decent haunted house does, but what ended up happening was I spent way more time actually just gawking at how much I loved the monster designs as opposed to actually being, scared of them. The creatures are what got me in the door, but what I stayed for was the game's interesting take on the whole kill the big bad evil guy plot, along with some fun, albeit kinda shallow characters. The writing is good, but not anything to write home about. However, I will say that, if anything, the game's attempts at dark humor really hit home with me. I thought that was really good. The game's plot revolves around Brian Pasternak, a lower middle class nobody from the boonies who receives a letter detailing that he's been hired to the biggest company around, Sintracorp. He goes along with this despite the fact that he barely passed high school and has no outstanding characteristics whatsoever. After showing the letter in question to the sole camera in the lobby, the elevator opens suddenly, taking him straight to the CEO's office, where "Kill the Witch" is scrawled in blood along the monitors that make up the back wall, and a contract sits on the desk that locks Brian into his new position. He soon finds out that the bloody writing across those monitors wasn't a vague cry for help, it's actually the job he was hired to do. Another interesting part of this is that almost everyone in the named cast is an actual flesh and blood person that's putting up with the office out of hell for the amazing paycheck, which, yeah, I would too. If I had to pick two I particularly liked, it'd have to be Kate solely for her optimism in the face of literal hellspawn, and the horrifying goblin man with gouged out eyes who's probably the chillest guy in the entire game despite how he looks. Dude just sits around in a blanket made of his own beard hair getting stoned and giving you magic powers in exchange for your save items. That's right, this game has limited save items, just like Resident Evil ink ribbons. This and the fact that you need an entirely separate resource to activate most of the game's save points makes it so you have to push yourself into potential death just to make sure these resources you pick up actually last. Outside of that, the game's actually a fairly standard adventure game where you look for items to solve the game's several puzzles to progress the story. Most of them are very easy and straightforward, but keep in mind there's a couple of puzzles that really made me have to sit down and think before proceeding. The game's soundtrack was composed by Garoad, the person behind Valhalla's fantastic soundtrack. Yuppie Psycho's soundtrack is no exception, and I hope Garoad continues to float around the indie scene working on whatever projects they like. I do think some of the tracks don't really fit to the horror tone the game was shooting for, but I like to think that it was just part of the game kind of reveling in its own campiness. I really enjoyed this game, but there's one thing I'd like to say about it before I can actually recommend it. I had a lot of performance issues trying to play this game. You're probably wondering how I even managed that with a game that clings to the retro aesthetic as much as this, but the issues actually prevented me from finishing the game. After running out of save items in the late game, I found myself surviving the game's monsters pretty well, but I was very far from my last save. The game proceeds to crash on me after a cutscene, tossing out the progress I'd made. Yes, it was my fault for running out of save items in the first place, but realize that losing that much progress for reasons out of your control is a great way to take the wind out of somebody's sails. I ended up watching the rest of the game on YouTube, and my motivation was even further tanked when I realized after that cutscene I was put on the path to the final confrontation with the witch. I'll probably go back and replay the game someday, but not for some time. If you decide to pick this game up, try to keep these performance issues in mind, and note that the game itself isn't buggy at all in my experience. It's more that it pulls a Google Chrome and eats up way too many computer resources and just dies sometimes. All that aside, I do suggest that if you're interested in horror games or just want to enjoy a good, fun, horror-themed adventure, there's way worse ways you could spend the fleeting few hours left in October. I don't regret the time I put into this game, and I feel the asking price is more than reasonable for what you get, especially if any of what I've said resonates with you especially. The game is $16.66, which, yeah, hardy har, but at the time of recording, it's actually on sale for, I think, around $12. I'd say get it if you can. It's a better price on something that was already pretty good. This was originally supposed to be a sort of double feature, but exams coupled with my self-imposed Halloween deadline saw that I'd missed that mark. Despite that, I'd like to thank the Zesseract and Purple Lemon Does Stuff for recommending World of Horror to me. That's another game that's right up my alley. I enjoyed the demo immensely, and will most likely make a video on it sometime after its full release. As for the next proper An Excuse to Talk About video, suffice to say that it's on its way. I have my eyes set on a game series, but considering they're RPGs, it'll take some time to actually play through all of them. Don't worry though, only 4 of them actually managed to make it to the West, and I fumbled my way into getting physical copies of the 3 I actually, care about. Expect more small projects in the meantime, because that one's still a little bit of a ways off. I also wanted to say that the Brutal King Rants video I promised at the beginning of the year is getting pushed off indefinitely. I know that there's a minority of you who are actually really interested in that video, and I just don't really have drive to dive back into that series at the moment. Sorry to wrap this up on a bit of a downer, but thank you guys for sticking around, and I'll see you next time whenever that may be. Maybe December. December seems like a good pick. Maybe.